Tell me your name. Does it call you? Tell me your name. Does it speak you? Does it hear you? Does it feel you? Does it love you right back when you speak it out loud in the night? Tell me your real name. My real name is Sitawa Namwalie, and I am a poet, playwright, performer. I'm a general all-round creative, actually. And I'm a Kenyan. I'm going to be talking today about decolonizing the arts. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this talk. Now, the first time I heard the term decolonizing was actually when I was in high school. And I encountered Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I encountered the book Decolonizing the Mind. There I was in a very, very Mzungu high school. It was the 70s, and the Mzungus had not left Kenya yet. The white people had not all left Kenya yet. They were still here, and we, the Africans, were now entering their spaces. And the schools and the independence government had certain rules in these schools. You couldn't speak your language, yeah? If you spoke an African language at school, other than Swahili, other than Kiswahili, you got into a lot of trouble. I later on discovered that this is something that happened in many, many countries that had been formerly colonized. But until then, until I read Ngugi, I was like, what's wrong? Nobody's explaining, they're just punishing you. And you're a small child, you're like, why are they punishing us? And then the other thing was our hair. The things that are normal, the way it grew out of our heads. The natural, hair that we had was always a problem. We had to either cut it short or you had to braid it. They had rules about what to do with our hair, but they did not have rules about what to do with the Mzungu or the Mwindi hair. So we were being targeted. And again, nobody's explaining. You go home, you're just told, yeah, you have to follow rules, right? You can't ask anybody, you can't ask your teachers. You're just sitting there alone in your confusion, wondering, what is going on? And then I read Ngugi wa Thiong'o and I couldn't believe it. It all fell in place. Because he explained that these were colonial rules that had been carried over by the independence government without any explanation to those who are now being afflicted. And we're wondering, but why are they allowing those ones to do whatever they want, to speak whatever language? They never had a rule about speaking German or Italian. It was our languages that they had rules about, yeah? And this book was so important because it meant, it took me from a place where I was in turmoil and confusion. I was like, oh, that's what's happening. It's our colonial hangover, as we came to call it, that is continuing. So the book was called Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book. And what does it mean? What does decolonizing the mind mean, right? Because it's something that, many, many years later, many decades later, in this century, in the 21st century, we're now really talking about it. We're really doing something about it. And many African countries, like Kenya, are 50-something, close to 60 years after independence. Why are we talking about it now? Only now? Well, let's look at some definitions. So I found this definition: decolonizing the mind means to deconstruct the thoughts, the preferences, and the values derived from the colonial way of thinking. And this is a process that inevitably leads to even more fundamental questions, right? So it's something that, and it's decolonizing our lives, it's decolonizing our language. Our eyes, the way we see the world, has been so impacted by our colonial heritage, the way we see ourselves, right? And then an additional part of the decolonizing definition, okay? So decolonization was once viewed as the formal process of simply handing over the instrument of government. So we got our independence on December 12, 1963, and the Union Jack, the flag of the British, went down at midnight, and then the Kenyan flag went up, and we were like, voila, we are now free. But our minds had been captured, yeah? And it is now recognized that this is a long-term process involving bureaucratic, cultural, and linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial power, right? So we know it's a long-term process. It is still continuing, yeah? What does the colonized mind look like, right? So I really wanted to first of all think about what does the colonized mind look like? For us, what do you think? I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think, what do we look like in terms of the colonized mind? Since we've acknowledged it's an ongoing process, meaning that all four of us here, sitting here, are still colonized. We still have this mindset. So Marvin, what does it look like for you?
In my view, the colonized mind is a mind that, first of all, doesn't have a sense of identity.
Okay.
It has already lost its initial God-given, perhaps if I'm allowed to say, identity, right? And decided to take on a different identity for whatever reason, both good and bad, right? The colonized mind doesn't think along the borders or within the boundaries or using the laws that come naturally to its immediate environment, but instead chooses to focus on the laws outside that given environment and move along in that same way. And at the same time, I can't sort of criticize the colonized mind because the very term colonial, or rather colonialism, came with the white man, right? And you've mentioned Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and if you'll allow me, I'll also perhaps mention the same. He says in one of his books, you cannot change a people's culture overnight, right? It's going to take time.
Absolutely.
It's not something that happens, within just a short span of time. And the main reason is because in as much as they came with so many other negative colonial aspects, there are also some positive colonial aspects. And it's going to take time to delineate between the positive and the negative.
Okay.
And as hence, the duration of time becomes a little bit more.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I just want to add to what you've just said, that we come with my colonized mind, because it's about me, it's about us, it's about each individual.
Yes.
Comes with shame. It comes with a lot of shame. So many of us are walking around with shame about being who we are. And that shame is passed on even from, you may not have had an immediate reason, but it is passed on generationally. Your grandparents, your parents, yourself. So for me, for example, I come from the western part of Kenya, and my parents put me in a school, in a kindergarten, and it was called Ora Drummond Kindergarten, and I did not speak English. And they put me in there a few years after colonialism into the hands of white people who had dominated us, who had done all sorts of things to us. I have no memory of what happened in that kindergarten. All I know is that by the time I left, maybe after a year, I still didn't speak English. Okay? And all I remember is that I had an incredible sense of shame. Right? So I carry with me the shame from that situation. And I do remember that before that, I was a joyful, happy, adventurous child. And then I went, whoop, and I closed. And so now my own personal journey is learning how to trust the world again. Yeah, I can only imagine what happened to me. And we know that not remembering, having no memory of a situation, is a sign of the degree of trauma that you experienced. Yeah, so it's a mind protecting itself. So the other thing that has happened for us as colonized people is that our way of life has been totally invalidated, right? So if you look at education, if you travel around this country, you will find little children who, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, they're carrying a djembe, they can basically they're farming, right? So they've had duties as with their families, and those duties are helping them learn how to farm, and they're capable. Their cognitive development is so high. You'll find pastoralist children, little children, herding cows, goats. They're competent. They've learned all sorts of things. But then when they come into the formal educational system, right, that we continued without question, the colonial one that we continued without question, we don't acknowledge that this child has got very well developed cognitive, abilities. We're like, ignore that, and then we start saying A, B, C, D, you don't know, And imagine if I have a dream that we will begin with understanding what the cognitive development of our traditional educational systems have already created, and then build on that. It would be extraordinary. Who would we become if we had that? Another thing is the product of that is that we literally have the inability to see and to acknowledge ourselves, like in this world, right now. So if you look at, and here I'm talking about, remember I'm talking about being an artist, whether you're a painter, whether you are a writer, whether you're a playwright, whether you're a poet, right? Many of us begin by, copying Beyonce, right? So we'll copy some Western person who we think will validate us, right? And then later on, we'll begin to realize, no, but Beyonce is already Beyonce. I can't become better than her. I can only, if I go back to who I am, nobody can beat me, right? But that process of not acknowledging and seeing our environment, is part of the colonial experience, right? In terms of even how we dress, in terms of how we walk, in terms of how we hold our bodies, right? It's literally all over us. So our creativity becomes hugely compromised, right? And so we end up creating bad art, right? And then eventually, we begin to create wonderful art. You've seen Sauti Sol, for example, who really create from their roots, from our roots. And we are all excited about it. So whenever we see somebody doing an authentic thing, we actually recognize it and we're like, wow, So it speaks to us. As I talk about decolonizing, it is clear that the first step is to decolonize yourself.
Yes.
You cannot decolonize anything unless you yourself undertake the journey of decolonizing. And I assert that many of you are like me. When I was a child, we would be taught history, for example, and we'd be taught some Zungu discovered this, and so discovered Mount Kenya, and some British guy discovered Lake Victoria, and you see it's even called Lake Victoria, and I'd be sitting in class going, because I'm a child and the teacher is very authoritative, and I'm sitting there and the question I want to ask is, excuse me, teacher, what were my people doing when these people were claiming that they're walking around discovering? Did my people walk around with their eyes closed? And if I accept, teacher, if I accept what you're saying, do you understand that right now as I sit in this seat, I invalidate myself? And where do I go then? Where does my mind go? And I assert that many of you have had similar experiences.
True.
Do you, yeah?
Actually, if you'll allow me to say this, decolonizing the mind also has to be to come from a place of appreciating, first of all, who we are, right? And the experiences that I've had is that even my parents, right? Instead of being taken to a school, perhaps where you're with your peers, people who are like-minded like you, it is always the in thing, perhaps, to go to a school which has some bit of British, since you're Kenyan, British background. In other words, the schools that were established by the British and still have that form, or rather that system of education, right? Whereby even the teachers are white. Like in the school I went to, some of the teachers were white as well. And this is 30 years after independence.
But I'd just like to, I agree with you totally, but I'd also like to say that it doesn't matter which school you go to, because we have adopted an educational system that is a Western educational system that invalidates and has not figured out how to include many of our experiences. It's changed. Of course, there's been some developments. It's not like, we just sat there and accepted. Because the journey of decolonizing is actually inevitable. Yes. Okay, so we're talking about it right now, but I want you to know that it is inevitable. It is not, you're not like your parents. You're not like your grandparents. I'm not like my parents, right? My children will not be like me. Yeah? So it is for me, it is something that happens spontaneously because a human being must become comfortable with themselves. So it is inevitable. So I'm not, yes, it can be accelerated, and we want it to be accelerated, right? But I don't have a sense of despair about it, right? Because if you look at, for example, the minute somebody is enslaved, it is in that moment they seek freedom. You can't actually enslave a human spirit. You can't enslave a human soul. So you can't colonize and finish us. You actually, thank goodness you can't. And we're witnesses to that, right? We fought for independence, right? And we continue to fight. So one of the other things I just wanted to say is the thing about the colonialism, and the thing that we need to now do as individual artists is to look beyond the white lens. How do we center ourselves? How do we interpret our environment? Because that is our superpower. That is our superpower. Our superpower is our culture, our heritage, our world, our worldview. Yeah? Yourself as an artist, my superpower is there's nobody else like me. There's nobody else like you. That's your superpower. So when you give it away and decide, let me copy Beyonce or let me copy whoever, you're giving away your superpower, okay? So I wanted us now to go and look at some theories, yeah? Because I like to build on what has already been done. I'm not here saying, I'm the one who's invented these things. No. We're building on what has been done, on the developments on this continent and outside this continent. One of the most interesting and most powerful people and conversations around decolonizing that I have encountered are actually Native Americans in Canada, right? Maori people in New Zealand, right? So all of us, the Asian, India, for example, amazing thinkers when it comes to this, right? So this particular person is called William E. Cross Jr. He's an African American. And he's an African American psychologist. Yeah? He's a theorist and a researcher, and in the field of ethnic identity development, and specifically Black identity development, right? So we have, people have developed theories around decolonizing, right? And this particular one is called negrescence, right? It's a theory called negrescence, yeah? And what negrescence is basically, he's come up with the stages of development in the process of becoming Black. So when you start off as a child, or as, you're not even as a child, some people start off preferring the Western world, which we have been told is the world that gives us success, right? So it's not surprising. I have nothing but empathy for us. So I don't believe in pointing fingers and saying, the South Africans are more colonized, or the Kenyans are the worst, or no, we are all colonized. It is a journey that is a long-term journey. And I want us to feel empathetic to each other. When a woman straightens her hair, what is she trying to do? She's not being foolish. She's actually being very sensible. Our environment says, without straightened hair, you cannot progress. If you want a job in which you become a powerful person, you take on the mantle and the look of whiteness. In China, I have met lots of Chinese who will give you a Mzungu name, right? And I'm looking at them like, what's wrong with you? But this world is created in the image of white people. And if you want success, right? You're negotiating with a white person who can't pronounce your name. You take on, right? But that doesn't help us. We want to push against that, and we want to come back to ourselves, so that we have a world in which everybody has the right to exist and their existence is valid. Okay? So this guy really excited me when I encountered the idea of becoming Black. I was like, wow, okay? So he came up with 5, so I want to share this with you. He came up with 5 stages, okay? So the first stage he calls pre-encounter stage, yeah? Which depicts the identity to be changed. And which is, in which the person is, imagine somebody who's like, doesn't believe that, a Black person who wants to associate themselves only with white people. They don't even like fellow Black people. They've taken on all the stereotypes. You're primitive, Black people are primitive, or Black people are this, or they're not intelligent. They're all those things that the world has said, in my view, said so that they can take away our resources, because they've taken away our minds, right? There's a black people who believe that. That's a first stage, right? And then he talks about, so they've internalized the negative about themselves and about their community. Then he talks about the second stage, right? So the person then who has internalized can change, because you begin somewhere and you change, right? And this person, it's called the encounter stage. He calls it the encounter stage. And these people in the encounter stage must work around, slip through, or even shatter the relevance of their ideology and their worldview. So the worldview that they have, in which they see Black people in negative ways, this is now that something happens, and usually something happens. They have an encounter. They thought maybe they go to a school where they're busy hanging out with the white kids and thinking, oh, we're together, and then they're called a name, or they're excluded in some way, and then they have to, in their minds they have to assess themselves. They're like, oh my goodness, what does that mean? So that's the encounter with an incident that makes them start questioning their worldview, which is an anti-Black worldview, right? And then the third stage, he calls the third stage the immersion stage, yeah? In the immersion stage, addresses the most sensational aspect of Black identity development. And during this stage, Black people begin to shed now shedding, right? So the encounter stage, they're shocked, and they're now shedding their old worldview, and they begin to construct something new, a new frame of reference. They start going, actually, hold on, I don't believe those things anymore. There's nothing wrong with us. You know, my friend Marvin is really smart. You know, Steve is really, you know, so they start questioning, right? But it's the immersion stage, the person hasn't really committed yet. You know, so maybe they go back and forth and they're still doubtful, right? The fourth stage is the internalization stage, yeah? And the internalization stage encompasses a transition period where one is working through the challenges and problems of a new identity. So you began to construct a new identity. You've committed, right? You begin to construct a new identity, right? I'm sure that I went through my immersion stage when I'm in my internalization stage when I changed my name. So now I'm Sitawa Namwalie, right? So you very often you will change your name because you're like, but why do I have that name? You know, the names that your traditional names have so much meaning. You know, my Sitawa, for example, is the name of my grandmother, who is my father's mother, and then it's also the name of my great-grandmother on my mother's side. And those people have so much meaning for me, as opposed to my English or so-called Christian name, Betty, which is derived from Elizabeth. I didn't know that I was called Elizabeth until I was 10 years old. I was like, I've got no relationship with that name, like none, okay? And then so indicators of your shift will be that you begin to question your name, you may change it, or you begin to think about how am I dressing, you begin to question, you know, your world, right? And as you begin, and you also begin to create a new identity, you may also be very angry at having been duped, because this is duping, isn't it? That that there's something wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with us. We're not, you know, there was a time in my grandfather's time where, you know, during colonial era, we were told we have no history. It's not true. None of us here would believe that. And so the African historians were historians who learnt and taught Western white history. That was a historian, right? So then the fifth stage is the now commitment stage, internalization commitment stage, which focuses on the long-term interests of Black affairs over an extended amount of time, right? So I believe that I'm in the internalization stage because I'm really interested in, not just for myself, but for this continent. You know, so I'm really interested in this continent, and I'm interested in freeing people's minds, and so that we can have access to all of who we are and our utter brilliance.
I think I'm in the third stage because even as you're talking, I'm thinking about changing my name now from Marvin and just remaining with the two African names that I have, Kipchoge Mundia. You know,
that is such a beautiful Kipchoge Mundia. That is such a beautiful name. Those are beautiful names.
Yes, and even as you've said, those are the names that actually have more meaning for me.
Exactly.
As opposed to Marvin, which was just,
you know, it's like,
you know, obtained out of the air. So, yeah.
No, this is so exciting. But you can see that when you're talking to somebody, I don't know whether, before I say that, does this make sense to you? Like these stages, do they make sense to you? Yeah? Yes? I mean, we have to adapt them to our own situation. Sure. And I am working on I'm actually working on creating something for an African context, right? But I was so excited when I heard them. I was just like, oh my goodness, this explains so much. Yeah.
My question will be looking at the stages that you've just explained to us and looking at the very different ways that Africans or Kenyans would look at issues that affect their surrounding. is it possible to say that somebody can get changed maybe at the second stage by passing the other stages and maybe getting out and feeling like this is now what really expresses me as an African, expresses my inner being without having like to go through all of these stages as the theory explains?
Okay.
Yes.
You know, I actually think that we go through these stages. What this guy has done, is he's sat down and created a theory from the experiences of people around him. So he didn't create this theory from outer space. He looked at his people, observed them, because he's a psychologist, and then, you know, used science to actually, you know, develop these stages, right? And I know that other people have used this and these theories, and it's probably been expanded by now, yeah? So I think the length of time that you stay in one stage, I think can be different. But I actually think, you know, it made sense to me because I understood the stages I went through. I was like, oh my goodness, it's giving me a structure for the processes I've gone through as a person. Yeah? It also helps me understand why I shouldn't argue with some people, because somebody may be at the first stage and I'm at stage 5, right? And so we're actually not communicating. Yeah? So if you're an engineer, you know, the example of an engineer, if you are in year 1 of engineering and somebody has been working as an engineer on big projects for 30 years, you can't say that you're the same. You have to go through the stages, Cindy. You can't leapfrog and go from year 1 to year 30. Yeah?
It's not possible.
It's absolutely. So I believe that this what this gives us is really just a frame to help us understand the stages that we go through when we're decolonizing ourselves. Yeah?
And then I think, again, one thing that we have set as a way of conformation to the environment, and the environment here being the infringed environment where it is understanding from another culture, like now the Western culture, is what now creates the environment.
Yes.
Now bringing an understanding of us not conforming to the environment that has been created for us, and living within our own environment as Africans, appreciating ourselves as Africans, and really looking forward to getting to immerse ourselves into what really defines us as Africans, is a thing that is way out, but slowly it's coming in, looking at whatever is happening. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to challenge you on that, Steve. I'm actually going to say it's actually not way out. You see, once you start your process of decolonizing, the same thing you've been looking at, this pen, I now can see it in a totally different way. I'm going to now go into the final aspect of my presentation about how do we center Africanness right now. And I'm going to talk about Mekatilili Wamenza. You all know Mekatilili Wamenza. Mekatilili Wamenza, for those of you who do not know, lived anywhere between 1840 and she died in 1924. And she led the Giriama uprising against the British as they came to colonize this country that now became Kenya, right? So Mekatilili Wamenza lived at the coast, at the Kenyan coast, and came from the Giriama community, right? And she's a woman. And when the British came, they came as first of all, they came as a private company, the British East Africa Company. And they started to take land away from the Giriama. They imposed taxes, right? So they took land, fought, taking land, and then the Giriama are there on their land. Then the British say things like, well, now you're on the land, we're taxing you for being on the land. And the Giriama are like, this is our land. Who are you? You know? And then Mekatilili, at the time when they came, and when she started to fight for independence, lead the fight, It was in 19, just before the Western War, the first British Western War. This was 1912, right? So she starts to lead their fight, and she's a woman, right? And their traditions. And what she uses is a tradition of to gather the people, is something called the Kifidu dance, a funeral dance. So she uses a dance that was used only during funerals. And she takes it and uses it now. And she goes around dancing this dance and gathering the people. And they gathered the people, and people started to follow her, okay? And then, the way the story is told, we know the story, right? Right now I'm going back to that story as one of my decolonizing projects. I'm going back to that story, and I'm looking at that story in a different way. I'm looking at it from the perspective of Mekatilili and the Africans. The way the story has been told, even within our educational system, is that it's still through Western lenses. And how am I looking at it? Through African eyes. So first of all, I'm looking at the dance. I'm like, wow, yeah, the Kifidu dance. And then another way I'm looking at it is Mekatilili, by the time she's fighting the British, is in her 70s. She was not a young woman, okay? So I'm looking at the structure of the Giriama, and gender rules and gender relations, etc., and seeing how do you place her within the context of her community. And then one of the things that she did when she led the fight against the British is that there was a moment where a man called the administrator, they called him the administrator of that area. He was the British administrator. He's called Arthur Champion. He was trying to recruit the young men, Giriama young men, to join the war. And Mekatilili was having none of it. So she was against it. So there's a moment when she takes a chicken to him and says, in a public meeting, and says, if you do not leave our young men alone, and this is what's going to happen to you. And she puts the chicken down, and she says to him, with the chicks, it had chicks, and she says to him, try and touch that chicken. And he tries to touch that chicken, and the chicks, and of course it pecks him, right? Because it's protecting its chicks, right? And she says, that's what's going to happen to you if you try to mess with our young men and make them go to war and recruit them for your war. And then she slapped him in public. Okay? So this African woman slapped him in public. And he got really annoyed, and he shot the chicken. Yeah? And then he also shot people. He ordered his people to shoot local people dead, right? And we don't know how many people died, but a large number of people died, right? And I'm thinking, when I'm decolonized, I'm thinking, she slapped him. An African at contact with the white world had the agency to express her full range of emotions. So because she'd been fed up with these people who were coming and messing them, she slapped him. Do you think that an African today can easily slap a Mzungu like that?
It's not easy.
Exactly. Because we've been colonized. Yes. Our agency and our ability to express all our emotions at any time, we've shrunk. Okay? Then one of the things that happened is that she led the fight against the British, and so they took her and they took her to a prison. They banished her, which is something that they did all the time. They banished her to a community that was almost 1,000 kilometers away. So she's from the Kenyan coast in Kilifi, and they banished her to Kisii in Western Kenya. Okay? And they were like, we've sorted this problem out. We've beheaded the leadership. She and the people some of the people who'd been locked up with her, and the people who'd been locked up with her, escaped, and she walked back 1,000 kilometers. Remember, this is 1912, 1914? Yes. Is there a road? No. Is there a car? Is there a railway? Did she use a bicycle? No. What did she use? She walked. Okay? When she came back, she found that the people were still fighting, and then they even increased their fighting when she arrived, right? The British were so shocked about how she walked and how she escaped that they branded her a witch. And they used to do that to delegitimize somebody, invalidate somebody, okay? As I'm working on this project, I realized the walking bit. I was like, oh, I had bought into, oh my goodness, how mysterious. How did she walk back, right? So I was caught up in that. And then as I continued to work, I remembered my grandfather. I come from Western Kenya. My grandfather would walk 20 kilometers one way to the shopping center and back as we arrived in our car. And we used to be like, oh, how are you walking? You know, he was probably in his 50s, but you know, when you're 12, somebody who's 50 looks like they're dying tomorrow, right? So they look like they're decrepit and dying. We're like, oh my God, how can he walk? I calmed down, I realized, but we always walk. Right now, don't we have pastoralists, communities that are walking all over the place? What did they use? The stars. They used the stars to navigate. Mekatilili being at the coast, being a person from a community that used the ocean to fish and etc. and to travel, they've got excellent knowledge of the stars. We had excellent knowledge of our environment. We knew what the sun was doing. We knew what when you're traveling from Nairobi to Mombasa, for example, you see the change in the ecology. You know, you reach a place where there's huge baobabs. You reach places where there's dry savanna, right? And if you're not westernized like the rest, like we are, you know, that is something that you've learned to pay attention to. That's where your education lies, right? So I was like, oh my goodness, you see how simple it is? But I had to decolonize myself to start to understand. But right now, every morning, if you go to Kangemi, you will see at 5 a.m. people walking to industrial area. It's 18.4 kilometers one way and walking back, right? And in the history of humanity, this particular period when we're using cars and aeroplanes and going to the moon is actually very short. Yeah, the majority of the human race has relied on walking. Yeah.
How do you decolonize an African who has been born in this culture of the white man, and he knows that this is the only way he can survive? Like he knows that from education I get success, just as you pointed out, and from that life becomes easy when I use this technology. So he looks at the African culture as a way of going backwards rather than taking it positively, because it was a way in which was an advantage, especially when you talked about Mekatilili finding his way back to his home area. So how do you bring that opinion to him so that he or she may understand the advantages of regaining the African culture and being decolonized?
A thing like decolonizing, I don't think that I can impose an idea on somebody and tell them this is how you should be. Remember, I talked about the stages. They are at stage 1, maybe, right? And it is up to them to go through a personal journey or not. They may live and die at stage 1, right? And so it isn't my job. It isn't your job. It is each individual's job to decolonize themselves, right? And when I'm talking about decolonizing, it doesn't mean that we're not going to take advantage of the maendeleo in the world, the developments of the world. So I'm not telling you that you go back to, living in a grass thatch hut. No. Or you dare not use a computer or a mobile phone. We are part, what decolonizing is saying is I am part and parcel of this world. I belong here, right? No, I am not an accident. I am not invalid, right? I can then take whatever it is that I want, and other people who are not like me can also accept me as I am, right? Wouldn't it be a beautiful world if we, I remember seeing an image of one of those UN meetings when people from the South Pacific came wearing utterly traditional clothes, and they were very naked, just various parts of their bodies were covered. And they're sitting, and I was like, wow, imagine if each one of us just saw each other for the content of what we have to bring, not that you're not wearing a suit, you're not speaking Zungu enough, sijui what. Personally, I think it's a waste of time. And we're blocking the resources the resources in all their magnificence that this world and these people, different people can bring to the table. Yeah? So I'm really glad you asked that question. I think that really can end this conversation very well. I think this is, and I really would like to thank you. And I'm really excited to have done this. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.